This is SG2 Perspectives, a conversation with industry experts and SG2 thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we all expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery.
It's going to be exceptionally complicated to roll this out to, let's say, 250 million Americans, and they're each going to have 2 doses of this. We've never before had to do this in the United States or anywhere on the globe for that matter. So it's going to be a big test of our supply chain and our capabilities around really getting this done.
Hello, and welcome to another very timely episode of SG2 Perspectives. We're your hosts, Kelly and Trevor. In the last 6 months, our lives have seemingly been turned upside down, and a vaccine for COVID-19 is really held up as being maybe the one thing that can return us to normalcy. Today, we'll be talking about the ever-changing, at least daily and maybe almost hourly news about progress toward a COVID-19 vaccine. We'll also talk about what health systems need to do to prepare. I have with me 2 members of the SG2 intelligence team, Henry Soch, principal and foremost thinker in healthcare innovation, and Jeff Moser, principal and leader of our life sciences work. Thank you both for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for having us.
Let's start with the science. Do antibodies to the virus confer immunity? What do we know about this virus that is important to creating a vaccine?
Thanks, Kelly. That's a great question. As we get started here, I think the short answer is we don't know. That said, while there's a presence of antibodies after COVID, and it's been shown to wane over time, let's say 60 to 90 days, COVID immunology research is pointing to T-cell mediated immunity that may be longer term. Reinfections with COVID have been documented, but to date, they've been less severe than the first infection. So some information is coming in and we're learning more. But Henry, what would you add to that?
As of the time that we're recording this today, there's probably 200 research teams that are out there looking at developing a vaccine to be able to address the COVID-19 virus. And they're looking at it from a number of different perspectives. I don't think that one is going to kind of get the job done. There are a number of vaccine pathways that are being developed. A couple of companies are looking at what they call messenger RNA or mRNA vaccines. They're actually looking at messenger RNA, which we've never done a vaccine using that development technique before. That's going to be an interesting development, how that plays itself out and what degree of immunity it confers. I think we're still waiting for the trial data to talk about that. The second type of vaccine that's being developed is around a vaccine vector, and that's the vaccine that's being developed in conjunction with the University of Oxford. And they're using a modified form of the chimpanzee virus to try and create a vaccine for COVID-19. Every immunologist that I've read in the past 6 months or so says that we're going to need multiple vaccines to address this disease and for most of the vaccines that are going to be available on the marketplace. So the immunologists and the virologists that are out there right now think that any vaccines that are approved will probably require multiple booster shots to be able to make them effective.
And just to dig a little bit more into the process of vaccine development, where are we in terms of having a vaccine that's actually gone through all the clinical trials? How close are we to having something that's ready for approval?
As of the time that we're recording this, there are about 142 teams that are in preclinical trials. There are about 29 vaccines that are in phase 1 clinical trials, and there are 18 that are in phase 2 clinical trials. There are only 9 vaccine developers that are right now in or starting phase 3 clinical trials. And we're early on in the process, and we're still waiting for some of the results to come back in.
If the phase 3 folks are in an enrollment phase right now where they're getting thousands of people to enroll, they're trying to represent multiple groups of people, those ethnically as well as demographically, trying to qualify those candidates. And then you think about the idea that each of these or the majority of these vaccinations will require 2 doses. You can forecast we're looking at least 3 months just to get some of the preliminary data in to be evaluated. Is that a fair statement, Henry?
That's definitely right, Jeff. So the phase 3 trials, minimum of 30,000 people enrolled in the trials. They're in the registration phase now, fleshing out the panel set for those clinical trials. Most of the vaccines take 2 to 3 weeks to be able to determine their maximum impact so you can measure it. And then you've got to wait a certain period of time to be able to find out whether there are any adverse effects or measure the actual impact in terms of number of antibodies and whether or not there is a immunity conferred to it. You're clearly looking looking at end of the year, first quarter of 2021 for any significant data to come back.
We heard that the AstraZeneca trial had been paused due to an adverse reaction. Even as we're going through these different trials and we think that we're close, it's not necessarily a sure thing.
When the news came across the wire that the AstraZeneca trial was being put on pause because of an adverse reaction a patient had in the United Kingdom, the Twitterverse lit up and everybody was saying, see, we told you they're pushing this thing. As Dr. Fauci pointed out in his interviews and Dr. Collins from the National Institutes of Health, putting a pause on clinical trials is not an unusual instance. We need to be cautious about immediately assigning this to an adverse reaction to the vaccine itself. We need to find out whether or not this was truly caused by the vaccine or whether or not it was just a natural progression of the disease that the patient had.
I thought it was interesting, Henry, too. The stocks in the other two companies, Pfizer and Moderna, shot up because assumed that now AstraZeneca is out of the running. We just had the Kentucky Derby, so I just think it's kind of silly at some point, but it's interesting.
It is, very much so.
So there's a big difference between having a vaccine and having a vaccination available for the population. Creating the vaccines like a dragon slayer, just building their sword, right? Like you haven't done anything yet. You just have kind of that first step. So what's it going to take once we have a safe and effective vaccine to actually produce it and administer it to the population? What's the process going to look like here?
A good question, Trevor. The good news is we're already starting this process. So we can't afford to wait until a vaccination or vaccine is developed to roll out the plans for vaccination of the public. So this is going to be exceptionally complicated. It's going to be managed through the CDC. So it's a national program, a national strategy with some parameters that will have to be met. If you're a medical office, a clinic, a hospital, a pharmacy, or other group of people that are wanting to provide the vaccinations, first and foremost, you've got to qualify with the CDC to say, yeah, you can be a site. The CDC is going to look at those sites regionally, nationally to say, do we have the appropriate mix, the appropriate coverage for the population across that mix? Do they have the right equipment? Can they handle the vaccine? Do they have the right refrigeration mechanisms and staffing of things of that nature? So they'll qualify the location. And then once the vaccine becomes available, the process will be fairly straightforward, as much as we can make something straightforward in the United States. If you're an approved site, you'll request your doses through the state. This is a health system. You may be requesting it through the Department of Health in the state. If you're a Walgreens, you may have contracted directly with the Department of Health, so you can contact them directly to get your doses. They would then make sure that, yes, you're an approved site. They would electronically alert the CDC that you need these doses. They would then allocate those doses out to you to be shipped out in about a 24-hour on paper time frame. And at that point, they would mail not only the doses, but also some level of supplies, PPE, needles, syringes, et cetera, to be part of that distribution to you. They'll probably be in short order, the vaccines at the initial rollout. If you are one of those sites, you'll probably be pre-scheduling patients to come or people to come in and get that vaccination. Because once it's opened, it only has a shelf life of about 6 hours. Now, the complication in all of this is we've got a number of different companies that are producing different vaccines, and they all have different storage requirements. They all have different handling requirements then because of that. And most of these require 2 doses. Henry, you can probably add some more comment to this, but I think it's going to be exceptionally complicated to roll this out to, let's say, 250 million Americans, and they're each going to have 2 doses of this. We've never before had to do this in the United States or anywhere on the globe for that matter. So it's going to be a big test of our supply chain and our capabilities around really getting this done.
Yeah, Jeff, you're absolutely right. It's important to kind of understand the magnitude of the challenge, which you've outlined very well. We talk about PPE, but we're talking about a number of doses, so more than one injection for this. The highest number of flu shots that we've done in this country is 168 million. And if you stop and consider that you're going to need to vaccinate at least half the population, they're going to require more than one dose. Will we have the supplies in terms of syringes, needles, vials, and the associated materials that you'll need to that? That's going to be a logistics challenge that we need to be able to address.
And one more thing to add to that, Henry, which I think is important to mention, is that the way people are thinking about this and innovating around some of these challenges that we have. So we saw, particularly during the spring and early summer, health systems around the country develop drive-through clinics, drive-through strategies. We believe that, of course, this will play through the vaccination process, and it will allow us to help reduce PPE and clinic space that we need. Also, there's been some legislation recently that's changed through the Department of Health and Human Services that is allowing pharmacists to give childhood vaccinations. And this is across all 50 states now. So we believe that this will help not only in the flu vaccination uptick, but also potentially in COVID vaccinations. And I should say, as a side note too, the pharmacists that do these vaccinations and then the paperwork and the tracking, they are, let's be honest, much better at doing this than a lot of our physician colleagues.
Thanks for pointing that out. Hopefully the supply chain shock that everyone felt this spring is actually going to help us be better prepared and build the supply chain resiliency to be a little bit out in front of some of the challenges that we anticipate with vaccine rollout. One huge barrier to widespread vaccination is patient fear and lack of trust. And the fact that everyone wants this vaccine to get out as quickly as possible, maybe with the exception of like RV salesmen, they're doing great right now. Vaccine development usually takes 10 years, $500 million. What are the pieces that can be sped up? What are some of those risk trade-offs that pharmaceutical companies are taking right now to try and get the vaccine out more quickly or as quickly as possible?
There are a number of issues that they're trying to address. We're in a situation that we've never been in before. So whereas in the past you could take as much time as you needed, people want this vaccine as rapidly as possible. And I think that the pharmaceutical companies announced a unique thing that's happened in the industry where all the competitors came together and said, we're not going to try and rush this to the point where we're going to actually apply for clearance from the FDA until we're satisfied that the clinical data shows that it's safe and effective. They've already broadcast that. And I think that some of the issues around, will it be able to provide immunity for 50% or greater of the population? Can it reduce the rate of symptomatic disease by 50%? Can we at least get data from 3,000 patients to be able to kind of try and accelerate the time frame? I don't think they're going to wait for the entire 30,000 pool of patients, but if they can get 10% of that, they'll probably look at doing that. And then they also have the ability to take a look at data on a regular basis through this data safety and monitoring board that the FDA has, and they can look at that and try and accelerate based on what they're seeing at various points along the development side. That's the other thing that they can do to try and accelerate the process. The big issue is whether this comes as a formal FDA clearance for the vaccine or whether the FDA decides to release this under an emergency use authorization. And that's one of the things that I think we have to monitor going forward. Does this follow the traditional approval pathway, or is it released under an emergency use authorization?
And Henry, once we get approval from the FDA and the regulatory agencies, who decides who gets it first? And what does that rollout look like to the entire population?
One of the concerns that has been expressed by epidemiologists and immunologists around the country is, what's the prioritization? There's a concern on some of the professional societies, like the American Health Insurance Plans put out a bulletin, recommendations to the National Academies of Sciences about whether or not this was going to be widely available to a broad subset of the population and whether it was going to be triaged to those who need it first without limiting certain portions of the population, either by race or by ethnicity or by age, from getting access to those vaccines. And at what price? I think we're already seeing some requests from organizations like AHIP to be able to get some clarity around what that looks like.
Let's go to a higher level. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the expanded role that health systems could play this year regarding flu vaccinations. Some of those are going to be similarities with COVID vaccination, but a lot's going to be different just because there's going to be different prioritization. Availability is going to be an issue, and there's a bigger lift in terms of patient education. What do we recommend the health system's role should be?
I think that it's clear from the polling that's going on today with regard to this whole vaccine controversy that patients and their families are going to look to health systems and their physicians as the sources of true information about whether or not to get a vaccine when it's available and when the time is right to be able to do that. I think we would encourage our members to look at, first of all, was the vaccine cleared under the traditional approval pathway, or was it approved under an emergency use authorization? Secondly, I think is important is, was the clinical trial data that was used to clear the vaccine released to the public? Having the full data so that clinicians and immunologists can take a look at it and determine the validity of that and whether or not there are any concerns based on the clinical data, that needs to be publicly available information and not kept behind a firewall someplace. The third thing is whether or not the vaccine that is cleared provides meaningful and measurable protection against COVID-19, such as fewer people getting sick or fewer people getting more severely ill from it. Hopefully, the best outcome is fewer people transmitting the virus after exposure. What we want to do with a vaccine is to prevent infections and deaths. And so meaningful and measurable protection thresholds, including whether or not the vaccine clears the 50% threshold for effectiveness that the FDA previously announced as a requirement for approval. That's critically important. The next thing is the vaccine meeting the effectiveness thresholds for all members of our population, for all the major demographic groups, by age, by gender, by race? And that's important to make sure that we know that patients are disproportionately impacted with pre-existing medical conditions, patients over 65, Black and Hispanic people, people with certain genetic makeups have higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and kidney disease. So we need to make sure that it's effective in all of the population. Is there a follow-up plan, as Jeff outlined earlier, to determine how many patients got the vaccinations and how long the protection will last? Is the immunity durable over time? If this is approved under an emergency use authorization, we won't know whether this is, because we won't have the long-term results about the testing subjects, we won't really be able to know how protective it is for at least a year or longer. That's going to be important. Finally, does the trial address any safety concerns in terms of safety or effectiveness? And the challenge that we had earlier of effectively administering this to 300 million doses, are there any complications that are associated with that?
If I could add just a couple things to that, Henry, the stakes are high on this. You think about the pharmaceutical industry's reputation, and one of the reasons why I think they banded together to say we will not put something out unless we know that it is safe and effective, and we're not going to skip steps due to undue pressure on the timeline. That their reputation is at stake, but so is the health systems. We've got to be very careful with making sure that they have met the criterion that you just outlined, those key things. So if you have that in hand, then I'd say full bore forward with your strategies for marketing, for patient engagement, through the community engagement to rolling out this vaccine. If it doesn't meet all of those criteria, or even just a few of them, then be careful. That would be our guidance, to say, be careful that your brand isn't damaged in something that isn't quite right and might have some bad outcomes associated with it.
I think that's absolutely right, Jeff. It's important to understand that I think for health systems, the ability to track these patients long-term, so this becomes kind of a big data issue. How do I know what vaccine Jeff got versus what Henry got? Did they get both doses? Can we do regular follow-ups with that patient to find out whether there are any long-term symptoms or side effects of the vaccine? That's going to take time, but we all know that we want to approve a virus that gets us out of this. And so I think there's this big data and tracking aspect that has to be part of any program that's put together around vaccinations for COVID-19 to make sure that we can track those patients long term.
And just one last thing to add, Henry, to that is I think it's important to recognize that, yes, there is no national immunization database, but each of the states have these information systems through registries. They've been tracking it, especially in the pediatrics population. So we can leverage this information. So we're not necessarily starting from scratch. We don't want to take away from the fact that we need to coordinate all this data, but at least we're not starting at a starting point of zero where we have no data. We've got some stuff. We just have to coordinate it.
Thanks. That's a big lift for health systems. That's a lot on their plate. Thanks for running through all this. Generally, it left me much more hopeful that we will get somewhere. We'll get there as quickly as we can, but we're going to do it in a safe way. Wow, thank you both. We covered a lot of ground. And again, you left me more hopeful and better educated, so I appreciate it. To our listeners, if you like what you're hearing, please always listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. There's also another podcast from Vizient that I want to recommend. It's on our medical leadership channel. It's called The Modern Practice and takes a clinical look, clinical leadership lens to many of the same strategic problems that we're talking through here in SG2 Perspectives. Thanks for listening and stay healthy. This has been another great episode of SG2 Perspectives, where industry experts and SG2 thought leaders explore the drivers of tomorrow's healthcare strategies to inform today's decision makers. Contact us anytime by sending an email to sg2perspectives@sg2.com. We'd love to hear from you. SG2 revolutionized healthcare demand forecasting with the Impact of Change forecast, and today we're the industry's premier strategy advisory firm. To learn more, visit sg2.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you again soon.